Hello, thank you for coming out tonight. This is The Fall That Wasn't, a decade since the financial crisis. My name is Ajay Singh Chaudhary, and on behalf of Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, I'd like to thank Verso for being partners on this event. I'd like to thank the audience for coming out and everyone who's watching at home, and I'd like, of course, to thank all of our fellow panelists, especially our guests, Sarah and Astra. I'll do proper introductions for everyone, including Rebecca and Raphaële, in a moment. Louder? Okay. Oh.
The mic. There you go. Can you just sort of speak into your mic?
Got it. Hello. Is this good?
Yeah, I'll take care of the volume.
Okay, sure. Well, I'll go straight into introducing everyone, and then I'll give a little spiel. To my left is Sarah Jaffe, who is a reporting fellow at the Nation Institute and the author of Necessary Trouble, Americans in Revolt, which is from Nation Books. All the way to my right, and that is just figurative, always every event I have to make this fucking joke, is Raphaële Chappe, who is a core faculty with the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, specializing in economics and political economy. She holds a PhD in econ from the New School and an LLM from New York University School of Law. Her research focuses on risk and neoliberalism, the political economy of debt, wealth, and financial inequality. It's particularly apt for tonight. She also practiced as an attorney for 8 years in the financial services industry. As I said, my name is Ajay Singh Chaudhary. I'm our executive director, but more importantly for tonight, I'm a core faculty member at the Brooklyn Institute specializing in social and political theory. I hold a PhD from Columbia and a master's from LSE, and I work on a bunch of stuff. I'm currently trying to write a book on political theory for the Anthropocene, which is why I snuck in all of these little things about carbon on that timeline that we'll talk about later. All the way to my left is Rebecca Ariel Porte, who is also a member of the core faculty at the Brooklyn Institute and teaches a variety of courses in literature and philosophy, currently Proust, which I hear is going quite well, and thinks an awful lot about Paradise, Arcadia, and the Golden Age. So, tonight's event, The Fall That Wasn't. So the 2008 financial crisis shook to the core not only the global economy, but also prevailing myths about the efficiency of markets, the possibility of endless profits and growth, and the inviolability of capitalism. And so tonight we've sort of called this, like, I don't know if this is a celebration or a mourning or a reckoning or what this is, but it's a wide-ranging panel discussion of the causes and contexts of the crash, as well as its lasting, overwhelming consequences for policy, politics, and culture. And on your seats, you'll find this. Do you see this like timeline? It's actually, it says, the name of the event, and it says a timeline question mark. I was compiling this. Last week, actually 2 weeks ago, our deputy director, Suzanne Schneider, who is a historian, was like, hey, Jay, you should really make sure there's like a historical record, there's a timeline, there's a chronology at this event. And so as I started putting it together, you might not be surprised to learn that there are many timelines of the financial crisis. This doesn't surprise me, but it is kind of funny to see it play out, right? And everyone's sort of preferred timelines, not that the events aren't true, but they tell a very specific story, right? So there's a lot of people, in fact, the prevalent story, people really want this to start and to end with Fannie and Freddie, right? And some bad mortgages, what's called in certain kinds of economic language sort of moral hazard, and sort of market distortions that were introduced by the state. And some people, on the other hand, want to focus on maybe deregulation. I know Raphaële is going to be talking about this. But this just so pushed my buttons on the sort of politics of history telling that I had to include on this these couple of bits, 2 from Walter Benjamin and 1 from Rahm Emanuel. So, right, like this. So Benjamin has this really famous line, right? To articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. This doesn't mean to lie, right? Or not tell the facts, but it means that we want to find the facts that tell a certain kind of political story, that give us a certain kind of arrangement that give us some kind of emancipatory possibility, right? And this sort of, I won't read the whole thing, but the sort of clincher, right, is only that historian will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins. And this enemy has not ceased to be victorious. To me, this is a perfect introduction to talking about the financial crisis, because there's a tendency, right? There was actually, I think it was an INET conference, but like a second or a third one, where people were like, oh, crisis over, right? We got past that, right? It was actually just a little fluctuation. This is a wonderful retelling of this in Philip Murawski's Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste. And yet, that's really not the case, which of course is the sort of bigger question that's not about the politics of history, but about the politics of crisis, right? Is that moment in 2008 sort of a special punctuation, right? Is it that the crisis? Or is that really more of a revelation, right? The moment when actually things are laid bare. You can actually see all the pieces working and why. There's a really amazing quote at the end of Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism that points at this, and then I'll shut up and give it over to Sarah, who I also know is going to talk about Mark Fisher. Yeah. And he writes this, and it's great because you'll see her. This is the very end of his book. He says, "The long, dark night of the end of history has to be grasped as an enormous opportunity. The very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism," this is, in the general sense, the idea that old Thatcher line that I quote way too often, right? There is no alternative, right? That has been ideologically enforced, right? The pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have disproportionately great effect. The tiniest event can tear a hole in the gray curtain of reaction, which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. And with that, Sarah, take it away.
Yeah, so the slides. Are we have the slides? Yeah. Okay. Oh, not that one. That one. Because we're just doing a bunch of plugs for books that aren't Verso books tonight. Sorry, y'all. I love you. We can work in some plugs for some actual Verso books, too, I'm sure. So I'm going to also definitely talk about capitalist realism, but I just wanted to say that, like, a lot of us probably spent the day today watching the Supreme Court hearings. And if you feel anything like I do right now, you're probably already drinking, and it's actually a weird relief to talk about the collapse of global capitalism. I mean, also because we want that to happen, but, it was in fact sort of terrifying when it happens. So I also refer back to this skinny little book a whole lot. And the line that Fisher actually drew capitalist realism from was the one that's variously attributed to Zizek and Frederick Jameson. I think we're going to say that Jameson is the correct one, which is that it's whatever. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. They're going to fight about this right now. Would you like to have a debate?
Actually attributing the statement to someone else who we
Jameson's
don't know.
initial
Okay, so whatever. Somebody said the damn thing. Point being that it's something that I think about that is a little bit different than just there is no alternative. It is that it is impossible to imagine this thing ever ends, not there is no alternative. Because I would say, and I've been picking at Fisher's new collection, which is also not a Verso book, sorry y'all, today, that we are still sort of living in at least the world made by people who believe there is no alternative. But we can now imagine the end of capitalism, and can I get the, yeah. Because when the crisis was happening, The Economist was imagining the end of capitalism. All of these publications which make their ongoing living selling us the idea that there is no alternative, and not only is there no alternative, but we shouldn't want one anyway because this is the best of all possible worlds. So this was going on, and I remember these greatly. I quote a bunch of these in my book. The fact that, like, as this thing was happening, and I always sort of want to ask people, like, do you remember where you were when X thing happened? But as it was happening, it didn't feel like any one event. It was just snowballing from like March of 2008 onward, I think, was when most of us who aren't economists started to figure out that something was different about this, that this was like actually shaking up the world. And so I collected a few of these because I like them. There was this one, the End of American Capitalism, from the Washington Post, saying, the casualty is American-style capitalism, don't we wish? There were, what was this one? Capitalism and Convulsion, Toxic Assets. Remember Toxic Assets? And the way we talked about all these things, the way, not we, because I wasn't getting published by any mainstream papers back then, but the way that the people who got to write about this, who were usually business reporters and front page reporters, wrote about this was like, it was literally like, this is ended. We were imagining the death of capitalism, and people who like weren't happy about it were imagining the death of capitalism. And it can be hard to remember what that felt like in that moment. Like, not only this kind of thing, but like the bailouts, and are we going around the free market, and are we going to nationalize the banks? And this article we love because it's actually trying to convince us that like nationalizing the banks is totally the capitalist thing to do. That kind of question, which like of course we didn't really do nationalization, right? Well, I'll let people who know more about that talk about it. But and then you had, this one was Fareed Zakaria also saying that what was it? Will historians look back and say that this was the week that American capitalism died? On CNN, this is whatever. And then you have these books, A Failure of Capitalism, How Wall Street's Greed and Stupidity Brought Capitalism to Its Knees. Like, we have now learned how to imagine the death of capitalism because it looked like it was trying to kill itself in front of us. And the left didn't do it to it. It did it to itself. We didn't kill it. It didn't actually die, although it sort of died. Mark Fisher was also not the only person to use the metaphor of the zombie neoliberalism, zombie capitalism. Capitalism is undead. But of course, the bailouts and the quote-unquote nationalizations just kept infusing it with blood or brains or whatever your favorite undead creature needs to live on. And the thing that we're still stuck with after 10 years of austerity and bailouts for the banks and 7-8 million homes lost in this country and a number of other things that I'm sure my co-panelists will get into in great detail, has been coming up with the alternative. And so even though, back in the day, we also got, this. People were going back to Uncle Carl over here. Even in 2008, this was from October 20th of 2008 in The Guardian. But there weren't a lot of people in any sort of power or even in any sort of position other than at a couple of universities really arguing this in public in any real way. And particularly in the US, and I know Astra is going to get into this, so I will try not to step on her too much either, we weren't there with an alternative because all of this was happening, of course, in this election where like most people to the left of, George W. Bush were trying to get rid of George W. Bush and trying to defeat John McCain, and Barack Obama was the hope and change. And I should have put in some of the articles from the sort of early days of the Obama administration with like Obama as FDR and the Green New Deal and all of these things, because that was another whole narrative that we got very early on that also didn't materialize. And there weren't really protests in the streets right away. There wasn't that kind of a reaction. And in fact, the reaction that we got in this country was literally reactionary. It was the Tea Party. We didn't get a left response for a little while. In this country, I kind of attribute that to people thinking that Obama was going to fix it. We got the bailout, we got the stimulus bill, and we were sort of told that this was fine now, and that now we were going to pivot to healthcare. And that was the summer of 2009, which was a really fun summer, if anybody remembers the news that year. And then, it starts in Europe, it starts in Greece, it starts in Spain, it starts in these countries that are really getting flattened by austerity, that are really getting destroyed by the crisis. Ajay's got Yanis Varoufakis' book up here on the stack. And so it's not surprising that that's where we started to see alternatives being built too, right? So you had the protests in the squares, and you had the formation of Syriza, RIP, sort of. And in the US, then we finally got Occupy. It's not a coincidence, I think, looking back on this, that Occupy famously had no demands, because we're still operating in the space where, like, what is the demand going to be? What can we call for? What is the thing that we can envision? We got Black Lives Matter, which does have demands, but also has become something that envisions a future that is bigger, that has built actually and written policy platforms in a way that Occupy did not. And then we have this turn towards socialism in this country and also in other countries. We have the rise of Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, a bunch of others. But right now, the thing that I keep grappling with, and I'm looking forward to making everybody think about this, is when we're talking about socialism, we still don't know what we mean by it. We're still saying, okay, socialism, great, but like if we define socialism by Bernie Sanders' political platform, it's a $15 an hour minimum wage, single-payer healthcare, free college, all of which are great things that would like make a material difference in a lot of people's lives, but they do not by any means require the end of capitalism. A return to the mid-1950s is sort of the argument that we see put forward by a lot of people, this return to sort of mid-century social democracy, which I'll let Ajay get into the petrostate part of that problem, but the other one being that, like, well, those jobs are gone and they're not coming back, and we're not going to rebuild the country around factory work no matter what Donald Trump says. And in fact, this was the promise that Donald Trump ran on, right? Donald Trump did offer, at least on the campaign trail, something that didn't look like garden variety neoliberalism. But it was essentially like, we're going to go back to when everything was great for white guys who work in factories. And hasn't delivered on that either. He's just literally delivered basically garden variety neoliberalism with some little extra really blatant racism. So I'm wearing this shirt because I love it, and because I think we still need to be talking about what that alternative is. What is the thing that we can actually make after this moment, after we've, imagined the end of capitalism, after we've returned to calling ourselves socialists? We are still in zombie neoliberalism. We're still in, the undead period. We're still sort of staggering towards something. And even when we consider the possibilities of taking power, we're still looking backward in a lot of ways. And I think the thing we need to do to think about getting past this, to think about actually really putting a stake in the heart of capitalist realism, is to actually imagine what we want that future to be. Because we can't just say no anymore. We said a lot of no's in the last 10 years. Mostly it hasn't done a whole bit of good. I'm sure people will also reference the Greek referendum, which I made sure was included on the timeline because that was one of the biggest no's. And it didn't mean shit. And it was an inspiring moment. It was amazing. It was incredibly significant that it happened, and it didn't stop anything. And so what is it that we're building? How are we building it together? How are we learning from these lessons around the world and connecting them to each other? And how can we be ready when the next crisis comes? Because, none of this has been fixed. And I'm sure Raphaële is going to talk about all of that.
Thank you.
So I will hand this over.
Hi, everyone. Is this working? Yeah? Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a real honor to be here with my fellow panelists. So I thought I would give you a little bit of background first, a little context of what led to the crisis, and really about the economic paradigm that followed the end of World War II and the golden years for the American economy. You had high economic growth, low unemployment, economic inequality at its lowest level. The income share of the top 10% dropped to the mid-30s. Today we're at 50%. The orthodoxy in terms of economic policy was the Keynesian paradigm of managing aggregate demand by way of government spending and smoothing out the business cycle. And things start to fall apart in the 70s. It's a very interesting, critical period with a series of adverse developments and disruptions. So you have growing fiscal imbalances due to the explosive costs of Vietnam, domestic overspending, you have the oil crisis, an expansion of the money supply to try to unsuccessfully curb unemployment, the end of the Bretton Woods system of dollar-to-gold convertibility, high unemployment, higher rampant inflation, for which a new term was coined, stagflation, ultimately leading to the Volcker shock, spike in interest rates, peak of 20% in the early 80s, which successfully curbs inflation. And these attractive rates mark the beginning of financialization, financial deregulation, and a high inflow of capital into the US. And this is also the beginning of a squeeze on real wages, which become detached from productivity and remain stagnant more or less until today. So as to maintain rates of return to capital in the face of this diminishing economic growth. So all of these pressure points lead to a new global financial architecture to keep the system from disintegrating. This is what Varoufakis has described as the global minotaur, which is a great term that he coined. And basically, the US is able to exploit the dollar's unique role as a reserve currency to start running large deficits, both trade deficits, which enables the US to buy cheap foreign goods, with dollars that get recycled through the US financial system, but also US government deficit spending, right? With the reinvestment of those dollars into US government debt, think China, right? So what's important for us in this story is that this marks the beginning of the omnipresence of debt everywhere at the private level. US households using consumer credit to maintain their standard of living. The government, at the government level, with rising levels of debt to GDP in all developed countries, but also debt within the financial sector that starts to increase in complexity with an increase in financial claims between all the different financial institutions. So this paradigm is characterized by global imbalances and asymmetrical growth patterns. It's inherently more unstable. And all of this brings us to 2008 and the financial crisis. So we have this huge increase in debt. Let me see if I can get to it. Okay, here it is. For those who are listening on the podcast or don't get to see this, this is just showing the evolution of debt leading up, through the crisis up until today. And you see, like, the large bulk is in mortgage debt. Now, remember that whenever there's debt, there's also a creditor. So who is investing in all of these mortgages? And we have to go through the mechanics of securitization, which maybe all of you have already heard about, so I'll try to be brief. After being originated, mortgages are pooled together in mortgage-backed securities, the famous MBS, whereby investors are entitled to a share of the cash flow, interest and principal payments of a specific pool of mortgages. The cash flows are channeled to investors in accordance with allocation rules that reflect different classes of securities, different rankings and priorities It gets complicated, but that's the beauty of securitizations, is it allows credit transformation. So you can create safe securities with a AAA rating, right, from the credit agencies, from riskier underlying assets. So it allows for the transformation of relatively illiquid risky assets into liquid marketable securities. So everyone likes this. The mortgage brokers like it because it gives credit to home buyers. The banks like it because they can move risky mortgages off their balance sheets. The investment banks like it because they earn fees for structuring these products. Investors like it because it's a whole new asset class to invest in with attractive returns. So mortgage-backed securities become a core holding of institutional investors, pension funds, mutual funds, as well as foreign investors, foreign banks, and even foreign central banks. So the rationale for these things, I found, I'm trying to move one slide. Yeah, there you go. This is from a Citigroup presentation. I'm not sure the year. Benefits, I think it's like 2005. Benefits of mortgage securitization. The benefits are gone. There are no benefits. Anyway, when we come back to the language, you'll see that the whole idea is to bring liquidity back to markets and something like that. And the rationale of why you would want to invest in those things is it gives great returns. So this is the Citigroup perspective on this in 2005. Now, in terms of the growth of this industry, you make the distinction between the underlying loans that conform to agency guidelines, the famous Ginnie Mae, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the ones that don't, the so-called subprime. And so the MBS market started seeing more subprime MBS reaching further down in credit worthiness to supply to more eager investors, and this leads to a decline in the quality of mortgage-backed securities. So what happened? In essence, you have the classic bubble, right? Rising house prices, fueling more debt because people are using the house as collateral, leading to the self-reinforcing dynamic. More debt fuels demand, therefore drives home prices up. Leverage increases. The financing regime becomes more speculative, and there's increased pressure on the underlying cash flow to service the debt. A default event can then trigger a downward spiral, with over-indebted investors forced to sell the assets, leading to a collapse in asset value, more defaults, etc. And the dynamics of this type of credit cycle, they're well described by some economists. You have people like Hyman Minsky or Stephen Keen, but interestingly enough, they're part of a dissenting, non-mainstream tradition in economics. And curiously, the mainstream models neglect the role of credit in the business cycle. So they miss the possibility of this, of a financial crisis of this magnitude. So I hope I can pull my slides up because I have a great Ben Bernanke quote. Oh, we're having a blackout?
We're having a crash.
So he's basically saying, this is in 2004, we've entered an age of great moderation. We've entered into an age of great moderation, and basically we have this macroeconomic stability now, and crises are things of the past. This is in 2004. And then in 2007, a great quote where he's basically saying, all the mortgages are doing great. We have no reason to be concerned at all, And then I think that quote is in your timeline. And 2 months later, boom, everything falls apart. So the securitized instruments, right, trigger these massive losses for financial institutions that hold them, and this is the whole beginning of the crisis, and the sequence of events is in your handout, so I don't want to go through all of it. But Citigroup Merrill Lynch posting losses, Bear Stearns in 2007 with the failure of the hedge funds, then in 2008 has to merge with JP Morgan Chase, Lehman Brothers filing for bankruptcy, AIG, you know, just the whole sequence and unraveling of this. Are we still black? We're dead. Yeah. Oh. Oh. I was going to show you the losses and how they were allocated between all the different institutions. Oh, wait, there you go. Okay. Yay. So, okay. Let me show you the, Mr. Ben Bernanke. So the whole thing crashes, and then, you know, you can see all the different institutions that were exposed to these products, right? And it goes from investment banks, commercial banks, hedge funds, insurance companies, finance companies, mutual and pension funds, and so forth. So there was a massive liquidity crisis with a dramatic contraction of the market-based supply of credit. Not so much a collapse of bank-based lending, but rather the market providers of credit, so the broker-dealers and other securities firms that are listed here, right? All of these guys. The mortgage-backed securities were no longer liquid, and this crisis immediately spreads from U.S. institutions to foreign institutions that also held these assets. So what's the best way to describe what happened? Different lines of explanations were given at the time, right? So first we were told, oh, it's because of the structured securitized products and the credit derivatives. They were so complex, right? The pricing was off, no one really understood them. And this is true, you know, there was definitely a failure of the assessment of risk and the probability of default of these things. The default risk was taken to be independent for each mortgage and unrelated to the other mortgages in the security. So failure of risk models. Then we were told, well, it's because of the housing bubble, people using their house as collateral, you know, bad, to take on mortgage they couldn't really afford. And so this pushes the explanation and responsibility at the level of the individual, saying, you know, people were taking risks they couldn't understand. It was their fault for not understanding, when in fact this ignores the fact that an entire industry had appeared to engineer all this and was profiting from this and was convincing people that they needed to buy these products. Third line of explanation, it's because of the bank's leverage and deregulation, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act in 2000 that deregulated derivatives. The banks that failed all had very large debt-to-equity ratios. I think Lehman Brothers had about 40-1. So they would be easily wiped out by a fluctuation in asset-to-equity ratios. And you know, the investment banks got away with high leverage because of an SEC rule change in 2004, and so it let the investment banks get away with more leverage, although some people suggest that all it really did was give the mortgage-backed securities favorable capital treatment when you're doing these complicated calculations about how much equity versus debt the institution is allowed to take. But this is true, of course, but I just want to point out, like in terms of the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which allowed the deposit-taking institutions to take part in the securities market and become players, note that the institutions that failed were not deposit-taking institutions. But still, the repeal of Glass-Steagall allowed for much greater participation of commercial banks in the securities market, fueling their growth. The next culprit was the accounting practice of mark-to-market, you know, which precipitated the fluctuation in asset value. You know, when you mark to market, no one wants to buy the asset. You have to immediately put a value of 0. And then finally, maybe bankers' greed, right? The crisis revealed that these financial executives could still get their bonuses even if the companies were failing. I love this example of Joe Cassano from AIG. He basically bankrupted the company and he walked away with a bonus of $315 million, even after AIG knew that he was the one who had made all these decisions. So there's some truth to that, to the corporate greed, but it's not the whole story. I was recently listening to a podcast with a professor of political economy at Brown, Mark Blythe, and he said, you can't explain a variable by a constant, which I thought was funny. And he said it with a great Scottish accent. You know? So I have a simple framework. Here's my explanation of the crisis. Oh, no. And this one, I really need the slide. Okay. Oh. Okay. There you go. Right. So this crisis was different from the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, we saw a classic run on the bank. So how does it work? So first, you have to understand the role of traditional banks to create money out of credit with a small amount of underlying reserves that are provided by the central bank. This is called fractional banking. And it's inherently leveraged, right? So the total amount of deposits, which is what the money that the banks create, is inherently more than the reserves, just by definition, right? And so, you know, I'm showing you here these numbers. We can go through that. These things can be measured and quantified, how much money there is in the system. This is what economists do. And you can see the ratio of leverage between reserves and deposits. Okay, so bear with me, right? What is a classic bank run? Everyone who has deposits want out, and everyone wants to revert back to the reserves, because reserves can be converted into cash. So people just want cash. No one wants the deposits in the bank. And because it's inherently leveraged and there isn't enough reserves and there isn't enough cash in the system, if everyone pulls out at the same time, it doesn't work. It collapses. That's a classic bank run. So you get this, right? This image here of people waiting in line to withdraw their money. The 2007-2008 financial crisis is a little bit different because really the conversion and the breakdown comes from the shadow banking sector, right? Now, what is the shadow banking sector? It's essentially a method of financial intermediation that enables for credit creation outside of commercial banks, right? That's why it's called shadow banking, because it's not inside the traditional place where banking should be. And so by bypassing commercial banks, essentially you have securities markets that enable the funding of underlying loans, the mortgages, but this is happening outside of the banking sector. And instead, it's happening through the participation of a host of other financial institutions. So who's in the shadow banking? The investment banks, the hedge funds, the mutual funds, the pension funds, and even AIG, an insurance company. And so in the same way that traditional banks create money by making loan, we can think of the shadow banking sector as also creating money out of credit, but it's doing it in a different way, right? And so what happened in 2008 is actual defaults on those securities in the shadow banking, right? You have the equivalent of a massive run on the bank. Everybody wants out of their position and seeks liquidity. Basically, everyone wants deposits. But there aren't enough to guarantee the conversion, because that's the whole point of the system. Everything is leveraged, right? No, it's a different, oh my God, I hope I didn't. Okay, so really all the factors that everyone blames for the crisis, right? Financialization, the deregulation of derivatives, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, the housing bubble, You can think of all these things as just factors that fuel the growth of these securities, these instruments that work as money. They're privately created. They work as money, right? But you occasionally have a run, an equivalent of a run on the bank. No one wants this money anymore, and everyone wants the level up, which is good old deposits with Citibank, right? But the system can't accommodate that. So what we learned from the crisis was the potential for this new type of bank run to destabilize markets well beyond the actual problem of mortgage-backed securities in and of themselves. Was the entire liquidity of capital markets that was at stake, so as to require active government intervention to basically resuscitate this market. And this brings us to how the US government reacted, not as a lender of last resort, as it did in the 30s, because this isn't a run on the bank, but rather as a dealer, what Barry Merling has described as a dealer of last resort, buying securities to restore liquidity. So this is how the US government reacted, and I think I have to hurry up, right? Because the response of central banks, right, was nothing short of extraordinary measures. So we got a regulatory response, we got the Volcker rule and, reduced leverage and all these things. But what we really got was a redeployment of the neoliberal state at an unprecedented scale in the form of the bailouts, too big to fail, and a radical new form of monetary policy called quantitative easing. And this is somewhat at odds with what we've been told, which is that neoliberalism is about laissez-faire and small government. This is not what happened in 2008. So the Fed engaged in a series of direct asset purchases that led to a drastic increase in its balance sheet. Pre-crisis, the Fed had about 700 billion in treasuries. And then we get the 3 rounds of quantitative easing, right, with a series of purchases of mortgage-backed securities and long-term treasuries. At the end of that, the balance sheet is at a total of 4.5 trillion. This is unprecedented. It decreased a bit since then, but not much. And this was funded by a massive injection of reserves. Again, this is a real paradigm shift in terms of monetary policy. And you can see here on the balance sheet of the Fed, the liabilities in red going up, that's the reserves. And this, if you see the long-term evolution of the liabilities of the Fed, you see the spike in 2008. This has never happened before, right? Now, why these radical measures? And this is, of course, because the ordinary monetary policy, just buying short-term government bonds, right, to lower the market interest rates, that no longer works when the rate is already at 0. This is known as a liquidity trap. So the Fed has to intervene as a dealer of last resort, as I've mentioned. This is a new role, and so this led to a paradigm shift for the Fed, a whole new way of regulating capitalism. And money creation and injecting reserves plays a key role in this. So we'll never know what would have happened if this 3 trillion new money, right, that was created was used differently, if it had been spent differently. Maybe buying underlying mortgages directly or nationalizing the banks or whatever, however that could have been used for. But what's interesting is we were not consulted, right? So the decision, it's a huge decision, but it's not something that's subject to democratic control. Still, there was a sense in which the government felt that it had to answer to the general public to justify what it was doing. So Bernanke was quoted as saying that the 13 most important financial institutions in the US, 12 were at risk of failure within a period of a week or two. So the message was, we have to act quickly and prevent this, or else the earth will stop turning. The very engine of capitalism will stop, so we had a gun to our head, right? So we've learned through this, I think, 5 lessons. First, that the neoliberal order of affairs can't afford this kind of Darwinian paradigm of creative destruction when it comes to the financial sector. There's something really special about financial institutions, and they're central to how capitalism works today. Second, our elites either had no clue of what was coming. This is the Bernanke quote on the mortgages, or if they did, they said nothing. But once there was a problem, they were very quick to react. There was no willingness to take advantage of the situation to obtain concessions from bank, none at all, right? The Fed provided support to specific institutions, such as AIG and others, but at its complete discretion. So this was an exercise in Schmittian sovereignty, meaning the sovereign is that which suspends the ordinary rules of capitalism. And this is where you see where the real power lies. And what are the interests for the protection of which this sovereign power is being deployed? And I think 2008 is the moment where you see this extraordinary intervention, and what interests is it really serving, right? And it's the interest of the banks. So we saw that the traditional Keynesian interventions are still possible, right? We did get a stimulus package. We often forget about it, 800 billion, but the numbers kind of pale in comparison to what was achieved by way of monetary policy. So our elites resorted to monetary policy in new creative ways. And finally, which is kind of mind-blowing, this actually kind of worked. And it worked better than in Europe, right? Where the European Central Bank also protected the banks, also did the quantitative easing, but not on anything like the scale that would have been required, and so you ended up with austerity. And so the elites claim that this is a big success, and Bernanke, our friend Bernanke, even says that this proves that Milton Friedman was right. It's too bad because it's a great one to look at. Basically, yeah, we did quantitative easing and we didn't have the collapse that we had in the 30s. Therefore, Milton Friedman was right. You gotta love this. So when I say that it worked, I mean that we avoided a downturn of the scale that we had with the Great Depression. The massive increase in money did not bring about hyperinflation or a collapse of the dollar, probably because it didn't really make its way fully into the economy, but it stayed on the balance sheets of banks. But at the same time, the recovery has not been exceptional. The share of income going to the top 1% keeps increasing. Corporate profits are high, the stock market is booming, but most Americans are not sharing this prosperity at all. So corporate profitability is not translating into widespread economic prosperity. This is Bill Lozanic, an economist. So we also saw in 2008, and I'm going to try to hurry up, be brief, many actors that introduced all this systemic risk into our lives, they actually got compensated for it. They're now living very good lives. Joe Cassano, I mentioned, in your timeline, there is Blythe Masters. She created the credit default swap and now heads a Bitcoin-related startup that just received, I think, 100 million in funding. Not to pick on those people, I'm not saying they're evil, and I'm not saying they broke the law. But although plenty of people broke the law and didn't go to jail, but at the very least, they played a part in the story of the collapse. They were part of the system that created systemic risk for the rest of us, and they actually got rewarded for it. It's the same story as Too Big to Fail: private profit, socialized losses. So, we already knew that risk and return was not well aligned in neoliberal society, but now it became really blatantly obvious in 2008. Okay, so to conclude, what are our post-crisis perspectives? Well, more than it was in 2008. And there's more debt than ever. And there's also more government debt than ever. Lots of charts to show you that, but we'll skip that. So I want to just really conclude by saying that we learned through the crisis, right, the potential destructive role of private money creation, this idea that markets get it right on their own. We sailed through the recession, right? But we have to be somewhat skeptical of what economists tell us, right? Prior to the 70s, it was assumed that there was a stable relationship between unemployment and inflation, right? So that you could lower unemployment by accepting slightly higher rates of inflation. And then that was debunked. And then we were told by Ben Bernanke, amongst others, that improvements in monetary policy was actually an important source of economic stability. And then the crisis happened. And when this crisis turned out to have the potential to be bigger than the Great Depression, we were then told that Milton Friedman was right. So in fact, what we see is monetary policy, and I'll finish with this, seems to be deploying these new tools of how to, with increasing magnitude and desperation. And it's true that quantitative easing was effective. The Ben Bernanke estimate is roughly an increase in economic growth by 3% and adding close to 2 million jobs as a result of quantitative easing. But quantitative easing 1, the first phase was more effective, and the subsequent rounds had less effect. So there's diminishing returns with this technique. And so the question is this going to work again the next time? And probably not. So what was pulled off in 2008, I'm not sure it could be pulled off again. And so I think the question is open, what our financial elites will do when they wake up to a system that they can no longer control. I'm sorry I was so long, but okay.
So that was actually like sort of the perfect handoff in some ways. Also, I forgot to introduce at the very beginning to my right, Astra Taylor, who is a writer, filmmaker, and co-founder of the Debt Collective. Her new movie, What is Democracy, which I look forward to seeing, will be out in New York City in January. And actually, that also gives me a wonderful transition because you are, in fact, mentioned in this horrible book I'm about to read from. I believe you are compared to Marine Le Pen in this book, or Steve Bannon, or someone. Steve Bannon, yes. So
it's an honor and a privilege.
So there's a wonderful synthesis here because here is a very distilled, good, how should I put it, consensus view on central banks. Make sure I find the right line. To set monetary policy and resist political pressure to create artificial booms in election years, that is, to respond to democratic demands. I added the Democrat part. More and more central banks became independent. Combine this with a footnote. While the American government was paralyzed by extreme partisanship in Congress and the European governments struggled to reconcile the diverging interests of northern and southern European countries, central banks spent trillions on assets to boost economies across the globe and moved to shore up regulations as the banks and markets they had let roam free in the years prior. So this is from the worst book of political theory I've read in a very long time. And I bring it up because there's an idea there that encapsulates quite a lot. I won't actually say the name. I'll just put it in the show notes. But this, you can find this in like all of those wonderful like crisis of democracy kind of books, right? The idea here is like, we need these independent institutions, right, to make decisions for us about these very, very complicated issues, and that they're acting, right? It's like a noblesse oblige, right? It's very aristocratic. They're acting in our best interest. Right? But the fact of the matter is, when this bailout occurred, when quantitative easing, when this monetary policy was instantiated, this was not done to boost economies. This was not done to rein in financial markets, and this, that, and the other. This was done for fundamental system preservation, right? This was not done on behalf of you and me. This was done on behalf of a very small class of stakeholders in the financial system, and even more importantly, as Raphaële noted, in the shadow banking system. So, like, one of the things, so my task here, which is a little bit crazy, is to do almost like the counterfactual, right? So Raphaële told you in detail what happened, right? I'm going to tell you a lot of things that didn't happen. and it's sort of cut into three pieces. Oh, closer? Yeah, cool. And it's sort of cut into three pieces. And I'll just say one other thing as I start, which is that, Sarah mentioned this capacity to imagine. This particular book actually uses the phrase, "it is impossible to imagine," like, I think 8 times or something, right? You can't imagine this, you can't imagine that, you can't imagine anything. And one of the things that's amazing about thinking about 08 and the sort of long tendrils it has, let's say, right? I tried to do this on the little outline, right? There's tendrils going backwards, like choose your poison, industrial revolution, colonization, whatever you like. And they can all go forward in all these kinds of ways, is that it's hard to put a lot of things back, right? There was this splitting open, right? As we saw with Sarah's headlines, there was all these options on the table, right? Depending on who's estimating, right? Raphaële used some numbers there. I've read about from somewhere between $4.5 to $12 trillion were created in this sort of long bailout / quantitative easing cycles, right? Even within capitalism, right? So I'm going to put off to the side right now what I think probably a lot of people are assuming, let's have a revolution, stuff like that. It's not that easy. But just even within what I could call capitalism, there's a ton of stuff that one could do. Right? If we look at those headlines, you see things like bank nationalization. You could think about other sectors being nationalized. That's actually not necessarily socialism, right? There's all kinds of things that can be. But as Sarah says, we don't 100% have our terms clear. There was a lot of people on the other side saying, let it, ironically, actually on both sides, far left and far right, saying, let it go. That's it. Let her fall. There's a really funny thing about Too Big to Fail. It recreates an old problem that plagued the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union and Eastern satellite states, which used to be called the soft budget problem, right? Which is let's say you're Yugoslavia and you have 1 or 3 steel companies, right? Nominally, if you're Yugoslavia, there's a market system, but it's still a publicly owned asset. But the people running it know they can spend down the budget and that you're going to refinance them. Why? Because you're the only steel company. So part of this story is about Too Big to Fail, and we actually have greater market concentration and greater financial concentration. Is that correct? That is correct. Today than we had in 07 or 08. Is about the way in which monopoly capitalism generates speculative bubbles, right? It's very hard to find good investment returns when you have monopoly capitalism, and thus you are tempted, you are incentivized. I'm very much a fan of Mark Blythe's work as well, and he has a wonderful line, says, if you or me were appointed the head of Citibank, Goldman, choose your poison, whichever it is, tomorrow, your options are actually very limited. There's only so much you can do. What? Oh, there's only so much you can do. So I'm very used to talking to people. But you could maybe be I'm going to dissolve the bank, but then you'll just be fired, right? Actually, these things are structural and they're incentivized. Right, so it's not about moral hazard. It's not necessarily just about greed. Although, yeah, it's annoying when people get rewarded for being assholes, which happens a lot. But right, there could have been bank nationalization. There could have been sectoral work, or frankly, the state could have stocked ATMs if it was really worried, as some of those headlines indicated, that there literally wouldn't be money the next morning. This was one of the things that Hank Paulson was very famously saying, if we don't do this by Friday, on Monday, there'll be no money. But the state can do that, right? You could take over vast swaths of the economy. 2 of my favorite examples of this, again, one's from Mark Blythe. He says, well, if you're going to use $12 trillion, giving it to a bunch of essentially private institutions with very little incentive to invest means they're going to do 2 things. 1, they're going to buy back stocks, which is exactly what they did. And 2, which drives up your own stock price. So, right, so I take a bunch of publicly created money or publicly siphoned money and make my own asset sheet become more valuable. That seems sweet, right? Or I use it to or I add it to savings, right? Maybe some little bits I do and add a little bit of investment here and there. But as everyone I think knows probably in this room and listening at home, things like even though we have had a decrease, for example, in unemployment in the United States in particular, there's this massive wage stagnation. Unemployment in European countries, particularly amongst the youth, varies between 1/4 and 1/3. It's quite disastrous. So Mark had this proposition. He said, you could take that money and literally throw it out of helicopters. This is kind of a spin on an old Keynesian argument. And it would be more effective than what we actually did, right? If you just spewed the money at people, they would pick it up and spend it on shit, right? Most of us have things we probably need to buy, and we would want to do that. What we did was not fundamentally about sort of securing people or securing even really ultimately like having a stable like life and all this kind of stuff. It was about fundamental system preservation. The last one of these that I love, I call the Obama House. You might remember like there was this like right-wing frenzy around the so-called Obama phone, which was just like, if I recall correctly, just like a Medicaid. I think as part of Medicaid, you could get a phone if you didn't have a phone. So like your doctor and your pharmacist could call you. Yeah, it's a horrible thing that no one should ever have. I'm joking, in case you can't tell. Again, perfectly within the realm of actually existing capitalism, the United States government could have bought every single so-called toxic asset. And it could have, and honestly, this kind of pisses me off as like both a political theorist and kind of as a strategist, because you would have bought political loyalty for like 3 generations, right? Imagine 100 million people with Obama houses, right, paying a 0.1% interest rate on their mortgage. That's a lot of loyalty. But of course, Democrats don't actually want to win or actually change things. So why were these ideas, from the simple to the most outlandish, not pursued, right? Even the most conservative rational case, right? This is what I would consider a right-wing rational response to what Raphaële was just talking about, would involve breaking up financial institutions, and getting, on the one hand, which, by the way, there was a wonderful article in the New Republic a few weeks ago that Obama reluctantly did, in fact, order Tim Geithner to break up Citibank, and Tim Geithner just kind of like stuffed it in his desk. He just decided that wasn't really going to happen. And again, very conservative, very classically liberal position. Those terms can get fuzzy, but right, would be that if you're buying something, you should get something for it, right? So if I'm buying a bunch of stock, I should get seats, at least for a little while, seats on the board, shares of the bank, whatever it is. This, of course, did not happen, and this was with public money. So part of this story is unquestionably political, right? And the other is to get a handle on how the world as we know it is, right? So the first point I want to make about this is that this was a private sector crisis. We tend to have a very nation-state mindset about things, right? We think of these national blocks, we think of GDP, we think of growth in GDP in terms of national blocks, sometimes globally, but actually, oh shit, am I fucking it up? All right, okay. Sorry. But actually, as Raphaële showed with the shadow banking example, a lot of this existed between firms, right? These are agreements happening from private firm to private firm, often overseas or across national borders. One of the items on your outline is in August 2007. A British bank, a British lender, Northern Rock, is the first major bank to begin to fail. And what's the weird fun fact about them? Why include them on this sort of timeline? What's up? Scotch? Oh, probably. Well, Scotland is still part of Britain, last I checked. But yeah. One of the things that's really fascinating about Northern Rock is that it had no ownership, it had no exposure to these weird mortgage-backed securities. It did have exposure, though, to other institutions through this sort of this private money-making system that Raphaële was describing, who then, in turn, had exposure to these mortgage-backed securities. And so what you start to get here is a picture of a world, right? And I'll talk about this in a little more detail in a moment. But a world in which there are sort of, there's a wonderful word for this, a sort of macro financial global model, right? In which there are institutions that are supra-state, right? That are above state boundaries. Part of this is also understanding, and this is, is the story that no one, especially like my good friends at the Columbia Business School uptown, really don't want you to be thinking about, which that the state really at best was negligent, captured, or both in this crisis, right? This is not a state crisis. There was a state solution, but at the behest of capital. A lot of Marxists, right, like to wave their hands in the air and make sweeping claims about the structural, quote, class character of the state. But to use the old lingo, the superstructure is far from a simple reflection of the base. And I think a lot of, especially us on the left, have gotten this like straight when we talk about like culture and maybe even religion, but like we haven't extended this observation to law and politics. And it's too much to go into all that right now, but I will provide I'm going to write a lot about this at some point, but I will provide a counterfactual that is very helpful for this case, which is that the right thinks it's extremely important to capture the state. The right spends a lot of time and a lot of money trying to dominate and control the state because fundamentally, and this is Hayek and all his friends knew from the beginning, democracy is extremely threatening to the interests of concentrated capital. I will sort of cite my favorite sort of critical theorist of law here, Franz Neumann, who basically argued that, there's an evolution over time, right? Historical materialism, shit changes. From state as a supervening guarantor, right, of contract rights, things like that, to today, the state sometimes as an aid and sometimes as an impediment to capital. And this is the splitting of sovereign and especially democratic functions from more purely coercive ones. I won't get into all the nitty-gritty details of this, but this counterfactual case, helps us understand why the state comes under the control of capital, particularly in eras of high concentration, and it is now almost the highest, if not the highest ever it has been. Okay. So as I mentioned, our wonderful friends uptown, I don't know what to call them, the economics faculty of the business school at Columbia, really want this story to be about Fannie and Freddie. They really want this story to be about market distortions. They really want this story to be over. And the truth is, and this is that second Benjamin quote on there, that things are status quo, that it goes on like this is the catastrophe. So this is a story about the freeing of capital. Why didn't we do these policy choices? Obvious policy choices. These are boring. These are easy. Some of this stuff is just super obvious. Why didn't we do it? Capital. So the second thing to mention is, again, that this cycle, this was largely a transatlantic phenomenon, not only an American phenomenon. So it was centered in North America and Europe, but it also went other places. But it isn't only an American crisis, right? One of the things that's sort of unprecedented, really bizarre, that happened in the financial crisis and its aftermath is that the Fed, the U.S. independent central bank, right, lent through a couple of intermediaries money directly to the European Central Bank. Basically, we were making money out of thin air, which is fine, actually I'm okay with that, but using it to prop up other foreign institutions, again, in the interest of maintaining the stability of this now global system. The common story that's told in Europe, right, which is sort of profligate Southern European states spent up the hilt and then couldn't pay back debt, is a complete backwards telling of the story. Profligate Northern European lenders created money like crazy, and then needed their balance sheets to be paid off by squeezing blood from a stone, which is austerity. And by the way, don't take my word for it. There's a wonderful paper issued by the IMF called Neoliberalism, Oversold, question mark. And it's really funny, you know, it's got a lot of defensive bits in it. But two of the things they give up in there, and they do it sort of like sideways. They're like, oh, don't look at this, look at this. They're like, oh, there actually is no evidence that this global free flow of capital is actually good for anyone, right? Which is actually the fundamental central principle of our neoliberal system. And two, austerity doesn't work. So the austerity doesn't work part is actually really obvious. One of my favorite bits of, I did bring the Varoufakis with me, and one of my favorite bits there is that like people like Larry Summers. People like Larry Summers are like basically like, yeah, what you're saying mostly makes sense. Like it's not that far off the mainstream, and yet it gets rejected as a punitive political measure, right? Sarah mentioned the way the no vote, right, oxy, completely just doesn't matter, right? That is the sort of evaporation of democratic state sovereignty and its replacement with a fiat, right? And I actually would quibble ever so slightly with just describing this as Schmittian, because it's actually not, it's weirdly not, right? At the center of these meetings is not some like king, is not some authoritarian dictator who like makes decisions and says yes and no. It's actually what Schmitt feared. It is just a kind of anarchic mass of private interests being like, well, how should we work it out? My favorite bit of Varoufakis' memoir is actually him going to one of these meetings and finally asking the Eurogroup and saying, what are the rules? Just tell me what the rules are so I can do it and like we'll just be done. Can you do this? Can you do that? And they like, I think they send out like an intern, of course. And like you know, some 10 minutes, 20 minutes later, they're like, actually this doesn't legally exist. There are no rules. And then they like basically boot them out and do whatever they want. So, right, at the sort of center of this thing that looks like a sort of, as Hayek used to call it, an economic constitution, right, but for the globe, right, not for a country, for the globe, is actually no, right? There's no center there, right? It's just filled, the vacuum is filled with private power. Okay, so, point 2. Capitalism is crisis prone. This is like not that controversial, right? Marx said it, but so did Schumpeter. It is a widely acknowledged belief. Keynes said it. It is pretty common. There have been a series of major crises over the course of the last century, as Marx predicted. But pace Marx, or at least some takes on Marx, the political outcomes are far more varied, right? It turns out, there is this bit of the Communist Manifesto everyone always forgets, which is like, everyone always remembers that the proletariat, you know, is going to be the grave diggers of capital. Everyone always forgets the other part where he's like, or the common ruin of all. That was always an option. But there was actually many more versions of a political play out for this than Marx ever predicted. We've gotten to know some of them, right? In response to the Great Depression, of course, was created a few of these regimes. Fascism was one of these, right? A very good way of preserving monopoly capitalism. Some of the forms of social democracy that, you know, which again, I think a lot of these measures would be very, very good, but we also have to look at sort of in the face and know that this was also a way to preserve a certain kind of forms of capitalism. And we should be honest, as Sarah encouraged, to know that there actually are a lot of questions that socialists don't have answers for. How do you price things? Do you want international institutions? Is your state going to be coercive? Probably, I would say yes. I know not everyone would probably agree with me, but right, these are kinds of real questions like that you have to actually deal with. I do have some ideas, but not all of them. So capitalism is crisis posed. One of the political programs that exists to sort of deal with this crisis situation is neoliberalism. I would say it's a far more capital-friendly and a far dicier and a far more effective version of extending these relations and the domination of capital than either fascism or social democracy were, hence its preference for neoliberalism. So what on earth do I mean by neoliberalism? Point 3. It's somehow become, like, I forget who was it, Jonathan Chait? Someone like, one of those people. They are all the same. It's actually true. They are all the same. They say that about me, so whatever. It's become like, oh, neoliberalism is too complicated. There's too many ways of understanding it. No, that is bullshit. That's ridiculous. almost everyone I know, like who like, as I just said, like IMF papers, like neoliberalism very commonly used in all of the poli-sci literature, whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm going to sort of give my version of why neoliberalism, sort of the nice nested shells of neoliberalism in a nutshell. So at the sort of highest level, and it's funny because I know in a week ago here, Quinn Slobodian and Adam Tooze were here, and they're excellent on this subject. But at the sort of most abstract or most sort of macro level, neoliberalism is an international legal regime, right? Above all, it perpetuates the free flow of capital. This is relatively new, right? I'm teaching John Locke to my liberalism students this past week, right? It used to be, and Locke is Lockean fucking liberalism, right? Is very specific that like if you want to up and leave a country, you have to leave your shit behind. Which is like also kind of gnarly if you think about refugees and things like that, but it also captures a really interesting idea that the sort of idea of capital flight is relatively much more new and was not taken to be given. Whereas Slobodian has a wonderful line about this where he says, the ultimate human right for neoliberalism is the right to capital flight. Right? That is, people talk about like open borders and migration and all this stuff. Actually, the neoliberal period has been one of the most restrictive periods for human migration in the entire history of our fucking species, at least that is recorded. In contrast, it has been the ultimate freeing up of capital movement and capital relations. And two examples are really illustrative of this. One is what Raphaële just showed you, right? Most of the money and debt, which is kind of the same thing, but it's complicated, that was issued in the in the run-up to the financial crisis was created by private institutions, not by governments. Two, this is an extraordinary paper that came out this past year. 40%, right? So there's all these places where legally there is like 0% corporate tax. Our corporate tax rates have been falling. In the United States, we've obviously cut quite a bit. In Europe, they've cut quite a bit. So that's like the on-the-book stuff. 40% of corporate profits are just simply unaccounted for. No one knows where they are. When people talk about like, I want a wealth tax, well, 40% of that shit is missing. And that's just of GDP. That's actually not of wealth. This is the kind of extraordinary freedom of capital of the world we live in. So that's our biggest shell. Underneath that, we have neoliberalism as an economic doctrine. What does that mean? That means the idea that markets will clear, they are the best possible optimization device for basically everything. And this sort of goes against the way in which it's sometimes portrayed, and Raphaële mentioned this. They require protection, right? If you go back and read von Mises or Hayek or these guys, they really want to separate out economic and political rights. And you can actually see this reflected in the EU today. When Syriza says, hey, come on, you guys have to take a haircut. You got to reduce these debts, right? The boot comes screaming down. When Fidesz says, hey, we're going to ban Jewish butchery and we're going to make sure the Muslims can only do this and that, and actually we're going to become like basically a proto-fascist state, Angela Merkel, the CDU, Germany, EU, they're like, hey, Fidesz, you're all right. Like, they're like, you're not our favorite, but we can work with that. This perfectly encapsulates what these thinkers and these actors, it's also political actors, were thinking, right? Those are political issues. That's what political stuff, that you can do that with politics, but you can't touch economics because they wanted to recreate and to save a world in which capital could flow freely. This is also has a really gnarly implication for the period of decolonization, right? This was also a way of catching states in the global south. As they formally decolonized, their economies would still be held nominally by institutions like the WTO and the IMF. Oh, what was then GATT, now with WTO. Okay. Oh, and finally, right, financialization for maximum profitability, to minimize risk, and to shift risk shift risk to the actor of least capable, who least produces it and least capable of absorbing it. Why do this? Because it's extremely profitable. And this also is a shift to extractive rent seeking. Most of the companies that you think of as sort of shooting up in the past 20 to 30 years mostly make their money off of rents, not off of traditional productivity. That's a very complicated story. Happy to talk about it afterwards. the third in our little like nesting doll, neoliberalism as a political doctrine. This is the one I think we're more familiar with, right? This is your Reagan, your Thatcher, right? This is, Adam Jaworski has a wonderful line in his book, Capitalism and Social Democracy from 1986. He said, it's a movement of the right to free capital from the fetters of democracy. I could not say it better. It's a perfect definition. That argument I was making earlier, that's in here, right? Decreasing democratic sovereignty while, right, the lie about making the state small is there, right? You're increasing coercive state power, right? You need to have much more enforcing power the less legitimacy you have. And in fact, what we are going through in many ways is a legitimation crisis today. And then finally, our last doll in the set, neoliberalism as a cultural reason. Right? This is the marketization of everything, right? Thinking about things as in a market, everything from molecules to mountains, right? This is the kind of thing you encounter in the works of, say, Wendy Brown or Jonathan Crary's work on sleep, right? The ways in which we start to sort of fine-tune ourselves as if these economic doctrines were true, although we kind of know, as Raphael just pointed out, that they aren't. Okay, so that's the world as we have it. Not a pretty picture. What are the costs of maintaining this world? As I meant, right, I began, this is about fundamental system preservation. So what does it mean? What does it cost to fundamentally preserve the system? I'll use just Greece as the example. Greece gets used as the example a lot. We could be talking about Puerto Rico. It's not an exact parallel. Although these forms of sort of post-democratic, sort of capitalist authoritarian governance, whatever you want to call it, there's a family resemblance between what happens in Greece, what happens in Puerto Rico, what happens in Flint, what happens in post-Katrina New Orleans, what happened many, many years before even Reagan, right, in Chile, right, is a way of instituting these kinds of changes. But I'll use Greece as the example. This is a quote from a Lancet article discussing the effects of austerity on Greece. Mortality changes in Greece coincided with a rapid decrease in government health expenditure. This is not shocking, sorry. But also with aggregate population aging from 2010 to 2016 that was faster than observed in Cyprus. They're using Cyprus as a pair comparison, right, to have as few variables as possible, right? It's also a Greek population, the Greek part of Cyprus. Causes of death that increased were largely those that are responsive to healthcare. Comparable temporal and age patterns were noted for non-fatal health outcomes, with a somewhat faster rise in years lived with disability since 2010 in Greece compared with Cyprus and with Western Europe. Risk factor exposures, especially high body mass index, smoking, and alcohol use. I don't see these as personal failings. I don't even see these as failings at all, frankly. I think everyone deserves a beer. But they're treating them correctly as the effects of social policy, not as personal moral failings. Explained much of the mortality increase in Greek adults aged 15 to 49. But only explained a minority of that in adults older than 70. They go on, right, to talk about the increase of the prevalence of suicide, of mental health conditions. One of the best bits of the book that Sarah and I were both quoting from the beginning of Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism is talking about the intensive increase in the global north, in the people who are doing kind of okay in some of this stuff, of having to be under extreme mental health regimes, the high use of antidepressants, high use of anti-anxiolytics, right, anxiety pills, to keep people going. And for what? So that's one way of looking at costs. Here's another way of looking at costs. If you look at your handout, you'll see a remarkable thing. In 1980, atmospheric carbon was 338 parts per million. The sort of pre-industrial level is 280. Today, I actually put that, at the time of the crisis on the back of your sheet, we crossed 400 and it'll never go back. The hurricane that just went through the Carolinas, we're gonna be living with stuff like that now for the next foreseeable many hundreds of years. We passed 400 just before the 2016 election. Today it's 411. 56% of all anthropogenic climate change, right, all anthropogenic carbon emissions, that is, have been inserted since 1980 in what is commonly referred to, right, as the neoliberal period. The cost of maintaining this system is staggering, right? From mental health, to other forms of health, to political destabilization, slavery in the Congo, water in Flint, increasingly less habitable global human ecological niche. The cost of this is breathtaking. And when we look at Trump, and today's example is a great example, we know that there are things that could be even worse. Neoliberalism promised us freedom, efficiency, and abundance, and has delivered bureaucracy, inequality, and an unbelievably high cost. But hard as some economists might try, this is not you, Raphaële, this is other ones, to argue that this crisis has passed and actually wasn't that bad and actually was just a mere blip or an aberration, it is very hard to put the political genie back in the bottle. And I do think we are seeing fruits of this in many fronts today. And I don't have the full map. We don't have cookshops of the future. But I will say this. A fundamental shift, not necessarily socialism, I actually don't know. I'm both more and less radical than some people. But a fundamental shift that is in favor of labor over capital, or putting capital back in democratic fetters, is vital. Capital must become slow again, and migration and human freedom must become fast. We must become time abundant and aware of the real cost of our system. And I will stop there.
Hey, how are you? Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to try to be fast. Can you keep your little clock on there? There's been a lot of talk from a sort of bird's eye view. I'm going to talk about activism both on the right and the left and offer a sort of unusual timeline of activism. But I just want to say one thing about the elites, because a memory came to me as Raphaële was speaking, and I was with a group and we were protesting outside of AIG, walking in our little picket circle. Kind of sad. And we were saying, they're crooks, they cook the fucking books. And this man who was going into work wearing a suit, and he stopped and he got right in my ear and he said, and they taste good too. So I think maybe they are evil. So I want to begin with an image that is probably familiar to people. It's an image, is it coming? Yeah. Oh no, this is late. Oh no, oh no. It's a little delayed. Anyway, it's an image of the free speech movement. Do you want to take me back? Sure. Yeah, let's work together and cooperate and show what socialism could be.
Things not working very
So, we're thinking about 2008 and we're thinking about 10-year anniversaries. Well, we've also been celebrating,
Winged chariot at my back, so I'm also going to try to be really speedy. But I want to thank everyone for all these really lucid presentations, which I think even managed to reach me in the cloud of unknowing where I amble through my days. So thank you so much for that. It's really an honor to be on this panel. One piece of errata, or maybe two. Raphaële, really Blythe Masters, a sort of architect of our crisis who gets away scot-free. Blythe Masters? That could not be better had it come from an Anthony Trollope novel. It's really just a perfect example of an allegorical naming convention. And Ajay, apropos of nothing, and choosing your poison, maybe, a phrase of which you are fond. There's a poisonous plant called monk shade, right? Yeah. All right. So this is a set of notes and queries on a proximate fall, rather than a kind of formalized thesis about art and aesthetics and literature after the 2008 crisis. In concession to the austere times in which we live, there will be no visual aids. So maybe our listeners at home will actually be glad of that. So I want to begin in a place that will seem a bit counterintuitive with a quotation from this 1949 European noir film called The Third Man. Features, it's a pretty good one, right? So it features, among others, Orson Welles in the sinister role as a character called Harry Lime. That's a very famous speech that he delivers. Don't be so gloomy. After all, it's not that awful. Like the fellow says, in Italy for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love, they had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. So long, Holly. So however sketchy the actual account of history that is involved in that statement, which makes for great melodrama, by the way, I want to say that people have always made art that arises from and speaks to the material conditions of their existence. And I want to quarrel a little bit with the thesis of Harry Lime that the end of strife and conflict and inequity means the end of great art. So great art will not coincide with the end of scarcity, even if the forms of our making, the very premises of what it is possible to make and interesting to make, and the very premises of what we now identify as art change. So poiesis, right, that Greek word meaning making, won't end. I think that's a pretty safe bet. We'll still tell stories and create objects to stimulate the senses, ask questions about things of deep human and non-human concern, create theses and antitheses, and broadly conceived, I feel really confident that there will still be some forms of activity we are constantly tempted to point to with the broad, strange names of poetry and poiesis. So I'll set this thesis of Harry Lime next to another quotation from a theorist who I've been returning to a lot recently. I've been thinking about her quite a bit today in light of Christine Blasey Ford's testimony, Lauren Berlant. And the essay I've been thinking of, which I won't talk about tonight, but I do highly recommend, is called Notes on Diva Citizenship, and it is about the Anita Hill testimony. So really, if you need kind of theoretical work that contextualizes this for you, that would not be a bad place to start. So here's the Berlant quote from a recent book called Cruel Optimism. For the past few decades, trauma theory has provided the main way of periodizing any crisis-shaped historical present. I prefer tracking the work of affect as it shapes new ordinaries to the logic of exception that necessarily accompanies the work of trauma. My aim is to construct a mode of analysis of the historical present that moves us away from the dialectic of structure, what is systemic in the reproduction of the world, agency, what people do in everyday life, and the traumatic event of their disruption, and toward explaining crisis-shaped subjectivity amid the ongoingness of adjudication, adaptation, and improvisation. What nations do, how power works, how persons manage the sensual work of the reproduction of life derives from stories constituted by a collective catching up to what is already happening in ordinary worlds shaped in a crisis defined and continuing now. So here I'm picking up on some things that our panelists have already pointed us to, which is that the one kind of major theme of the collapse was that there was revelation, but that this had actually been part of a crisis that had been with us for a long time and was newly visible, right? Which is not to say, kind of in light of what Raphaële was saying, that there were not unprecedented things that were entailed in this crisis. I don't want to quarrel with that. But I do want to say that there is something about the ongoingness and the problem of revelation, right? Did it do anything? Did it change anything? And I think Sarah and Astra have both pointed us towards ways in which we might have expected some things to be the same and some things to be different. What I want to talk about is a little bit about what art and aesthetics and literature have had to say about this, and what they might have to say about this. So something did happen, right? We've all seen the timeline. And that thing involves a number of complex chains of causality. And yet this business of registering the crisis as a crystallization of an ongoing precarity remains, I think, a problem in which much of the art and literature that has emerged post-crash has been deeply invested. So for one thing, and I'll just track a few major themes, we've seen the increased visibility of debt and austerity as explicit subjects, right? Both in kind of what things are about, but also kind of as formal strategies, right? How are we going to kind of use the forms of art in order to say something about what it is like to live in austere times or in ambient crisis or under the crushing psychological and affective burdens of debt, let alone the material ones. So what does an austerity aesthetics look like, and how pace brûlante do we register that sense? What does it look like in literature? Is there a sense of conserving resources, using perhaps workaday vocabulary instead of elevated diction? Is there a sense that experimental work can address this stuff in any way? I think the odds are pretty good that we're going to see a spectrum of responses, that there's no one particular mode of austerity aesthetics. Next, I kind of want to raise the issue of what revelation can give us. One way that a lot of art and literature of the financial crash has had of dealing with it is by going back and just trying on a very basic level to explain what happened, right? So I think one of the kind of exemplary, like, mass culture examples of this is the film The Big Short. Anybody see that, right? So it's this film that attempts to show you the logic of what happened behind the financial crash using a logic of exposition, right? It's all exposition. It's all kind of narrating the events, and they use a lot of sort of interesting strategies in order to kind of show you a sort of blow by blow of what happened. But it is, in effect, a kind of procedural lecture, right, on the mechanics of the financial crash. But exposition is really kind of interesting as a strategy in that it can help us to see what happened, but it also has real limits in terms of producing any kind of consequence. So just because we know something happened does not necessarily mean that we can bring redress for it, either in the sense of getting some kind of material justice or getting people just to do the thing where they admit that they're morally culpable, right? That they bear some of the blame. Even a sort of virtuoso testimony, and this is actually one of Berlant's points about Anita Hill's testimony, can show us the limits of the forensic, the limits of what can be known, and also the limits of how we can get a kind of catharsis, right? How can we sort of make emotional sense out of the incredibly catastrophic events that happened in 2008? And not to say that things hadn't been bad for a lot of people for a long time, or that particularly working class artists have not always been making art about scarcity, right? Maybe it's visible to a kind of broader demographic in certain ways, and that is one of the results of the financial crisis, but the art of the working class has always been with us. So the limits of the forensic, the limits of what can be known, there are also a lot of possible bad responses to exposition. One, denial that the thing actually happened. It is so easy to confront a fact you don't like by saying, no, it didn't happen, or it didn't happen in that way. Two, when something is admitted to be incontrovertible, the financial crash would have happened no matter what we did. It's just the logic of the market. So this evasion of responsibility, culpability, accountability, which is a funny word in this context, accountability. I cannot be to blame because it was just going to happen anyway, or it was those other people, or there was coercion broadly construed, or I don't feel guilty of anything, right? This throwing things back on the sort of moral responsibility of the individual actor. So what does it mean to call or to hold something or someone to account materially and or effectively, and how at all can art do that? So this is a question that I think a lot of makers of various kinds of artworks have been asking in the aftermath of the crash. And one of the things that it means for a lot of these artists to make quote-unquote morally serious art, and that's a phrase with which I have a lot of problems. But one of the things that it might mean for them to make morally serious art is to take up these expressions of culpability and blame, right? So you have exposition, you also have these questions of culpability. So let's have some examples, right? And I'm just going to rush through these really fast. So this is kind of, fiction has sort of caught up with us. We have a lot of novels of the crash these days. I'm just going to kind of give you a few. There's a whole universe of them out there. John Lanchester's Capital, Zadie Smith's N.W. might be construed in this way. There's a science fiction novel by Nick Harkness called Gnomon. There's a book called The Financial Lives of the Poets by Jess Walter. In film, we have Astra's own work. So we would highly encourage you to check out what she has done. Also, I'll plug Occupy, Scenes from Occupied America, which I believe is a Verso book. So, so that we have that going for it as well. So The Big Short, which I mentioned, an Inside Job, that's what that film is called. Lauren Greenfield's documentaries, which she's been making kind of for a while. I think even pre-crash she might have been interested in this set of questions. But Kids and Money, Queen of Versailles, Generation Wealth, those sorts of things, right? In art, I think of the fact that, Occupy, among the kind of many things that it had its hands in, was art. So there are all sorts of pop-up galleries and sort of ephemeral art exhibits that kind of took place orthogonal to traditional institutional contexts that sprang up out of the Occupy movement. I'm thinking also of something recently that I think they've shut their doors now, but Recession Gallery, which I don't know if any of you visited, but was a space in New York that was dedicated to affordable art and to art of resistance. So I'll also name check, just because it's more my wheelhouse, a number of contemporary poets. So Anne Boyer, who's been writing about kind of austerity and poverty and what it is to be working class and communist desire for a really long time now. Juliana Spar, who participated in our Marx Symposium earlier this year. Ashley Lambert, who has a really great little chapbook called Debt or the Crisis, which I'd recommend that you check out. Fred Moten, and an anthology finally called Austerity Measures, which is edited by Karen Van Dyke, and features the work, among others, of the poet Jazra Khalid. So it's an anthology of contemporary Greek poetry. And I'm just going to read you a little bit from one poem by a poet called Stamatis Polonakis. I'm hopefully not butchering that pronunciation too much, translated by A.E. Stallings. So this is a poem called Poetry Does Not Suffice. Gentlemen, don't let anyone deceive you. We were not bankrupted today. We have been bankrupt for a long time now. Today, it's easy enough for anyone to walk on water. The empty bottles bob on the surface without carrying any secret messages. The sirens don't sing, nor are they silent. They merely stay motionless, dumbstruck by the privatization of the waves, and no, poetry doesn't suffice since the sea filled up with trash and condoms. So you'll note here a sort of double way in which this poem, Poetry Does Not Suffice, is about austerity or is enacting austerity. So one, on the level of the content, right? We have a lot about privatization and bankruptcy. So these words that were kind of associated with financialization that we might think bear the taint of this kind of capitalist vocabulary that, that really maybe doesn't belong for some of us or to the ears of some of us in the tradition of serious Greek poetry, right? But we also have sirens, note, right? So those sirens are ones to watch. So you'll also note, if you could see this on a page, these short, unadorned lines, right? As if if you didn't have enough kind of length, right? As if even that was a luxury too far for a time of austerity, to write a lengthy line. And there is also an emptying out of the mythic richness of the sirens, who you'll remember from the Odyssey were these women who were nymphs, who were monstrous, and they sung sailors to their doom with their seductive song. And so they are often, in the tradition of Greek poetry, a sort of metaphor for the work of what poetry can do and what poets can do. Poets are sort of sirens. So if you empty out sirens, you are asking Why is poetry no longer useful? Why does it not suffice? Why does the song of the siren not work anymore? So it empties out these kind of mythic characters of the sirens who are capable of neither sound nor motion, the traditional tools of the sirenic seduction of poetry. Everything is at a premium here, even the resources of language. The open secret, right? The financial collapse sort of revealed a number of things that were kind of open secrets, things that we should have known all along or that we did know all along and were incapable of saying. The open secret of this poem, we have been bankrupt for a long time now. So what remains for the art of and after the fall to register in this world is both the worst of the wounds and the best that may be made of them on the terms of what we have been given. But always, always, always another open secret. And this is one that belongs to the future, so it may be harder to recognize as an open secret. And that secret is a world in which it is imaginable, to go back to something that Sarah really, really brought to our attention, that things could be different. So in this world, the one where we live right now, poetry does not suffice because one of its very sufficiencies is to demonstrate, without guaranteed redress, that the given world does not suffice for so many, and that other possibilities for our flourishing are imaginable. And this is knowledge that can be, in some ways, unimaginably painful. It's very hard to confront the idea that things could have been different. So no, poetry does not suffice, not yet. And the question that I'd like to end on is, what would we name the world? The world which, after all, might have been this one and might still be this one. What would we name the world in which it did?
We are pretty close to overtime, and by close I mean we are over time. Do people want to like say one final thing, and then, or should you said it all?
Yeah, go with peace.
I have sung my song.
All right, in that case, I will close this out and just say thank you all. Thanks again to Verso. This will be on our podcast, the Podcast for Social Research. You can support us on Patreon. And I echo Astra's hope that in 40 years we're able to have a talk like this where we are the boring people who won.
Yeah. But we'll look better. Hopefully we'll look better. We can be the cute people and the boring people who won.
Yeah, I didn't really mean actually boring.